Welcome everyone to the Friday edition of our Packers News free agency live chat alongside Pete Dougherty. I am Olivia Reiner. The Packers haven't made any big, splashy outside free agent signings. However, they are spending a lot of money to retain their own players. We'll take a look at the Packers free agency this past week. Plus, if you're over on Facebook, Periscope, or YouTube, we would love to hear from you. Please leave your question down in the chat. Pete and I are going to go read through some of your comments toward the end of our conversation today, and we promise to answer a bunch of them. The 2021 Packers are starting to look a lot like the 2020 Packers. The Packers this week have re-signed cornerback Kevin King and tight end Marcedes Lewis. Up until 2 days ago, the Packers were one of just two teams that hadn't signed any other outside free agents. That all changed on Wednesday when the Packers signed long snapper Joe Fortunato. That being said, why is general manager Brian Gutekunst opting to retain his own players over signing street free agents?
Well, I'm sure his thinking is, part of his thinking is they went to the championship game. They were in a great position to win it. They've been to the championship game 2 years in a row. He wanted to keep this team together. Re-signing Aaron Jones, I think, was really important because, in my opinion, after Rodgers, he's the most important guy for making that offense go. And I think they're looking at it as just trying to keep as many guys as they could together from a team that, was really close to going to the Super Bowl last season. Trying to get some improvement from within, and there is still, time to sign a free agent, or maybe even two, but at least one. Maybe not a huge signing, but once you have a good team, even a small addition at the right place can end up over the course of 17 games in the playoffs. Even one small move can end up making a big difference. We saw it in 2010. We can name off several guys who ended up being important, who weren't great players, but they still helped the Packers win the Super Bowl that year.
Let's take a look at the contracts that Marcedes Lewis and Kevin King signed this week. When the initial reports first come out about these contracts, or really any contracts in free agency, there's a couple of words that are attached to the numbers that are very important. Those words are up to. For Kevin King, it's a 1-year deal worth up to $6 million. For Marcedes Lewis, it's a 2-year deal worth up to $8 million. How do those numbers actually reflect on the cap this year and next year?
Yeah, the up to, it's always, the absolute most they could make, including incentives that they're probably not going to reach. Even when the agents talk guaranteed money, if they're talking money guaranteed for injury only, that's really not a guarantee. I think you look at even Lewis's deal, even though it's a 2-year deal, you got to look at it as a 1-year contract. So what matters is the guaranteed money in the first year pay. I think they had voided years on King's contract to lower his cap cost this year. His cap number was like not much over $2 million. So he's not a big cap cost. $5 million. I was thinking he'd have to do a 1-year deal. I was thinking $3 to $4 million just because of his injury history. So the Packers paid a little more than that, $5 million, but the $6 million figure was a little high. And Lewis, we haven't seen the exact breakdown of his contract yet. So we'll see how much of that is bonus and first year pay. I think the bonus they said might have been, was it $2 million for the bonus? I think that's what it was. So I wonder if this year, how much he's making this year, maybe $3 million total, 3 or 4, somewhere in there.
Let's talk about specifically Kevin King and the Packers' decision to bring him back. Over on social media, the day that it was reported that the Packers were extending him, a lot of folks were surprised to see that Kevin King was coming back to the Packers. In his 4-year career with the team, he hasn't always been healthy. He missed 23 games total. Not to mention that the last game that the Packers played, the NFC Championship game, lost to the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. There may be a little bit of a sour taste in Packers fans' mouth. King gave up 2 touchdowns in that game. However, when King is healthy, and that's a big when, he's a good player. He didn't allow a single touchdown in the regular season last year. How much sense did it make for Gutekunst to bring back Kevin King to the Packers?
I get it. I mean, they must have thought he was, for the price, he was better than anything they had available out there. I just looked at this yesterday. He's 26. He was young for his draft class, so he's only 26, and most of those corners, who are available, were 29. Most of them were 30, 31, 32, even 33. So those guys are in decline. At 26, if nothing else, physically he won't be in decline. The one thing that I wondered was whether his injury history, the Packers would just say, you know what, we think he's a pretty decent player, but we just got to move on because of the injury history, and you just can't count on him to be on the field. That's the one thing I wondered about. But as far as a player goes, I get it with the fans who think he's terrible because of that last game. He had a horrendous game. He also had the penalty at the end of the game that basically clinched it. But overall, like you said, I mean, he's been a pretty decent player when he played. I think he's a legit, decent number 2 corner. He's got a lot of talent, almost 6'3", and we all know the testing numbers from the draft a few years ago. When he and Alexander were on the field together for the last 3 seasons, the defense has been a lot better than when one or the other wasn't there. As a player, I think he's pretty good. He fills in the run game. He's a willing tackler, not always a good tackler, but he's a willing tackler. So he's a good player. The concern I would have, the risk I think they're taking, is just the injury risk, and that come December or January, he might not be. There's a better chance that he won't be on the field than some other guys.
From King to Lewis to running back Aaron Jones to tight end Robert Tonyan, cornerback Chandon Sullivan, Gutekunst has spent about $67 million in free agency. That doesn't even include the $169 million that he spent earlier last season re-signing defensive tackle Kenny Clark and left tackle David Bakhtiari. How much more money might the Packers be spending in free agency in the coming weeks?
Not a lot. They could still create, I think it's about $10 million in cap room if they just do a straight max restructure with what Rodgers still has left. I still think they're probably going to sign a defensive lineman or maybe an offensive lineman. They'll keep the cap cost down this year. And it may not be a big name player, but I got to think they're going to sign somebody before this is all done. And the prices were already at the point where the prices are coming down on guys. So I still think there are moves, or at least one move to be made out there where they can add somebody on either the offensive or defensive line. I think they could probably have still, $5 or $6 million of cap room to work with there, because they still have to cover their costs of the draft and their undrafted class. What they're going to want to have, probably $4 or $5 million at least of excess money to go into the season, because you always have to make moves during the season that add to your cap because of injuries.
Let's head over now to Facebook, Periscope, and YouTube for some of your questions. We've got a very inquisitive bunch in the comments today, so thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. We'll start with Mike on Facebook. Mike wants to know if we see Aaron Jones staying for the whole duration of his 4-year deal. Let's take a look at how this contract breaks down specifically. It's a 4-year, $48 million deal that includes $20 million over the first 2 years of the contract. And then on the third day of the 2023 league year, he is due a $7 million roster bonus. How does the construction of the contract have implications for Aaron Jones and his future with the Packers?
Yeah, basically, they've set it up where they're assuming he's going to be on the team the next 2 years. And after that, they'll play it by ear. And that bonus will be the trigger because they have to pay it in March. And if not, then he's a free agent. So does he make it to the 4th year where I think the salary really balloons? Highly unlikely. Maybe at that point they would, restructure and he'd take a pay cut or something. But, running backs' shelf life is it's just so short in this league. And Jones is already 26, I think going to turn 27 sometime later this year. So I think if they get 2 more very good years out of him, they'll have done great, and that might be it.
Thank you, Mike, for your question. Let's take another good question here from Jake on Facebook. Jake asks, so what is going to change from 13-3 to no ring to getting to the Super Bowl and potentially getting a Super Bowl? The Packers have been to the NFC Championship game 2 times in the past 2 seasons and have come up with absolutely nothing. The Packers are taking an aggressively still an aggressive approach, but could be seen as a conservative approach by some by spending a lot of money to retain their own free agents instead of signing free agents that other teams have decided that they do not want. How are the Packers banking on the fact that the existing players on last year's roster who are staying on the team in 2021 are going to take a step in this next season?
So I've been thinking about where, I don't know if you'll agree with this, where they could improve internally next season. I think at running back they will, with Dillon being the number 2. Jones is a 60% player. That's 40% for somebody else, which is a lot. Dillon's a more talented running back than Jamal Williams. So conceivably for that 40% of the game, they're probably going to be a better offense because of him. On defense, they should be better at inside linebacker with Barnes and Martin having gotten through their rookie years. They'll be second-year guys now. They should be in position to take a nice jump. I'm not sure there's a lot of areas other than that where they'll get much better. The offensive line should probably take at least a little step back without Lindsley. And the rest might be a wash. The one thing is, it's not uncommon for somebody who's been with the team for only 1 or 2 seasons to all of a sudden kind of blossom in year 2 or year 3. So there could be somebody who's ready to be a much better player this year than they were last year. That's always a possibility. There's also, there are years where you have 1 or 2 draft picks who really actually make a difference and help quite a bit. So, there's always that possibility too. But part of their thinking must be they were right there this year. And unlike 2 years ago in that championship game when they got blown off the field, they were clearly an inferior team. I mean, this last game was there for the taking, and they just, they had their chances in the fourth quarter with how bad everything went. They still had the ball twice, down 5, with a chance to take the lead, and they just didn't do it, even though they had the number 1 offense all year. So I think they're counting on being that, bringing back everybody else, almost everybody else, is that they have a really good team, and they just need a little improvement here or there, and that would be enough to get them over the hump. I'm sure some fans feel like they've done absolutely nothing, but you pointed out the re-signings, which that has taken up a lot of resources, Clark and Bakhtiari especially.
We'll see if the Packers are able to take another step with some of their own, essentially, this upcoming season. Thank you so much, Jake, for your question. Let's take a question here, a good one from our good friend Jordan. Jordan's always got some good questions. Do the Packers have an issue evaluating the cornerback position outside of Jair Alexander? Packers haven't hit on any of the picks or free agents, and some of the homegrown players leave and become better Pro Bowlers elsewhere. Casey Hayward, Demarius Randall, Michael Hyde being some of the examples that Jordan points out. If you look at the players on the cornerbacks on the roster right now, a name that stands out to a lot of players, a second-round pick, Josh Jackson, is coming up into his contract year and has really yet to crack the starting lineup. People had higher expectations for him. Where do the Packers stand in their evaluation of the cornerback position?
Yeah, well, the Jackson miss, so I guess you'd say for using high picks, Gutekunst is 1 for 2. He hit big on Alexander, and he missed big on Josh Jackson. And they're still, they're paying a price for that because Jackson just, he can't even get on the field. I don't even know. I mean, he's a guy who could end up getting cut at the end of camp with the way things stand right now. It's far from a lock that he'll be on the roster. So 1 for 2. It's a really small sample size, so I think we probably got to see him draft another corner high, which I would guess they would do this year to get a little better feel for that. But you're definitely right; they're paying the price for the Jackson pick. Thompson picked King, who was a good player for the most part, but the durability was a huge problem. Not to mention that they could have picked T.J. Watt with where they had the pick originally. Hayward, that was a Thompson decision. Hyde, so you can't pin those on Gutekunst. So I guess we'll see. But Jordan's right though. I mean, they're paying a really stiff price for using a high pick, second round pick on Jackson, and the guy just doesn't play at all. Oren Burks too. Those 2 picks, missing on both of those picks, has had a ripple effect on roster building for him.
Thank you, Jordan, for the question. We appreciate you joining us today. Let's take a question over on YouTube from John. John wants to know if quarterback Aaron Rodgers is as good as gone after next year. As far as we know, the Packers have not touched Aaron Rodgers' contract this offseason. They have not restructured it. They have not extended him. If they wanted to restructure Aaron Rodgers' contract and get some more cap space, they could do that without asking him, unless they wanted to add void years onto his contract and push some more money into future caps. They haven't, as far as we know, have done that, and they haven't extended him. What does Aaron Rodgers' future look like in Green Bay at the moment?
Yeah, it's pretty murky, isn't it? It looks that way to me. So if, we don't know what's going on with those negotiations, but let's just say they don't do anything to guarantee money for him next year. They don't, one thing they could do is they could move some of his 22 pay into this year and package that as part of a signing bonus. Or, though they've never done this in the past, they could guarantee some of his 22 salary. With a quarterback, I think they could justify it and say that they're not breaking precedent because, the guidelines and rules are different for quarterbacks. If they don't do anything like that, I think that opens up the door to a really good chance that he won't be back. Even if he has a really good year, he might just insist on being traded. And when these top quarterbacks, if he's an elite quarterback still, if they don't want to be somewhere, they can get themselves traded. I mean, Deshaun Watson was basically getting himself, even though he's young, was getting himself traded out of Houston until the legal issues cropped up here. He was as good as gone. And Russell Wilson's laid the groundwork for getting out of Seattle if he wants next year. And I think Rodgers has done the same this year. And if they don't guarantee some of that money somehow or other, I think there's a really good chance that one way or another he would depart the Packers next offseason. But that's an if. We haven't, they haven't done the reconstruction yet, and we need to see what that looks like before we know what might be going on there.
Tough to answer this question right now at this moment. We'll see if anything transpires between Rodgers' camp and the Packers in the coming weeks. Thank you, John, for your question. Let's go back over to Facebook. Mark has a question, the age-old question. Will the Packers sign a prime wide receiver in free agency? We can talk about the draft too. How likely is it that the Packers are going to acquire a receiver in some capacity this offseason?
As far as a free agent, it's looking slim. At least anybody who would be a bigger name. I mean, I think that ship has sailed. I would think, if nothing else, I would think they would draft a receiver this year, maybe even pretty high, probably even pretty high, just because that draft class they had a few years ago, those guys are all going in their fourth season now, Valdez-Scantling and St. Brown. And so they need to replenish with some young talent there. So, I guess we all thought they'd draft a receiver last year too, and they didn't. I'd be really stunned if they didn't do it this year. I think there's a pretty decent chance they would take one in the first 3 rounds. Not a given, but I think there's a pretty decent chance of that, pretty good chance.
With Marquez Valdez-Scantling and Equinemius St. Brown going into their contract seasons, it would make sense that the Packers would start to look for some young wide receiving talent in the draft. So we'll see exactly what Gutekunst's strategy is in just about a month. So thank you so much, Mark, for your question. Let's go to our friend Jaron over on Facebook. Jaron wants to know, is tight end Robert Tonyan still under contract with the Packers? Why didn't Tonyan get a 2-year deal? He was more productive than Kevin King. He was more productive, and Jaron also throws in the fact that Kevin King is back and that he fits the defensive scheme. Let's discuss Tonyan. He was tendered as a restricted free agent, so it's a 1-year deal. It was a second-round tender. How likely is it that the Packers want to come to a longer-term agreement with Tonyan in the near future?
Yeah, they might. Maybe they'll extend him during the season. But it's a different circumstance because King was unrestricted and Tonyan was restricted. So the Packers can get him relatively cheap this year. The $2 million, 2.3, I think, was a tender for the second-round tender. Pretty cheap for a really good player. So that was an economic decision, and they didn't have that kind of option with King because he was unrestricted. So it's a little tough to compare the two. But I could see him if Tonyan has a year like he did last season and he's going good in October, November, December, I could see he'd be a guy that they might try to do a contract extension with late in the season.
Thank you for joining us, Jaron. We always appreciate your participation. Let's go over to Richard on Facebook. Richard says that the Packers have to still draft a cornerback despite the fact that they're bringing back Kevin King. Where does cornerback fall on the list of priorities heading into the draft next month?
It's still way up there. I mean, I think corner, D-line, and O-line are 1, 2, and 3. You could almost put them in any order you want. Re-signing King made it, a little less of a must-have. They don't need to draft a starter necessarily now, where if they hadn't signed a corner, they would need a starter. But I think all 3 of those are in play, are the most likely for the first-round pick. Could be something else, but if you had to pick 3 positions and say, you're betting heavily on will it be one of those 3, I would go with those 3, and corner is still very much in the mix. And I think I would think they'll sign a draft a corner very high in this draft. That's a position where you have to have multiple good players, because you have 3 or 4 of them on the field at all times, and injuries can hit you fast and really weaken you. You got to be able to cover in this league. So corner is still a really high priority, I think, at least for Gutekunst.
Thank you, Richard, for your question, and thank all of you so much for joining us today. We really appreciate it. We will be back next week to continue to have these conversations as free agency continues and as the Packers get closer and closer to the draft in April. For Pete Dougherty, I am Olivia Reiner. We will see you next time.